All right, so hello everyone. I'm here today with Greg Johnson, whom I think most of you probably know. He runs the website Countercurrents and is a prolific author, intellectual, publisher, and just a fascinating guy. So, Greg, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience first.
Well, thank you for having me on. This is a very new audience to me, so I don't know what exactly I should say about myself. But you wanted to talk about Plato and Platonism, and that is an interest of mine. I have a doctorate in philosophy. Most of my coursework dealt with ancient philosophy. The absolute majority of the courses I took as a graduate student were on Aristotle and Plato and other Greek thinkers. And I've got a very strong interest in Plato, and I've published one book dealing entirely with Plato, which is the Trial of Socrates. It also deals with Aristophanes, but the core of it is Platonic dialogues. And I'm working now on another book on Plato, and I have this ambition. I don't know if I'll actually be able to live long enough to do it, but I have this ambition to write commentaries on all 35 Platonic dialogues and the letters that have come down to us. And then I'd like to move on to Xenophon's four Socratic dialogues. And there's a number of so-called spurious and dubious Platonic dialogues, Socratic dialogues that have come down from antiquity, and other testimonies about Socrates. And I would like to write about all of that stuff. I very much enjoy it. I find it edifying to read and reread the dialogues, and I find it pleasurable to write about it. And I think that generally I can bring something clarifying to these discussions. A lot of classicists, a lot of philosophers working in ancient philosophy, I think, introduce false premises or methodological problems to how they approach these texts. And I don't seem to be as easily bedeviled by that as a lot of academics. And so I want to have put my own takes on all of this material out there. I've taught a number of Plato's dialogues over the years. I've taught the Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, Theages, and Phaedo, connected with the trial and death of Socrates. I've done a couple of courses on the Republic. I've done a course on the Timaeus and the Critias. I've done a course on some of the shorter Socratic dialogues, one that dealt with Theages again, and also the Eon and the Hippias Minor and the Laches. I think that covers them. And I would like to just traverse the entire Platonic corpus and broader than the Platonic corpus, the Socratic corpus, and try and squeeze as much as I can out of it. So that's a long term project that I'm working on.
Yeah, I've thought about doing the exact same thing. I'm not really qualified yet. I'll give myself a few decades before I attempt that myself. But yeah, interesting. So there's kind of a convention of commentary writing, which involves, for Neoplatonists, kind of summarizing all of the previous commentary material. So have you gone through the majority of the Neoplatonic commentary, and would you cover all of that material, or would you just comment directly on Plato?
I just want to comment as directly and naively as possible on Plato, because otherwise, life being short and the literature being very very long, I don't think I would ever really accomplish my goals if I had to comment on all the literature. That said, I do read, traverse a lot of this literature, and I am informed by it to some extent, but I can't I can't imagine myself covering every commentary on the Republic, for instance. But I will certainly, when I write again on the Republic, and I have two sets of lecture notes that I did on the Republic, and also the recordings that students made of the lectures, and the lectures are often very different from the lecture notes because, well, you condense things, or you have new ideas, or you have to repeat things because you see that people are excited by something or puzzled by something. So anyway, I've got a lot to work with, but I am going to also deal, for instance, with the Proclus commentary on the Republic. I think that that would be definitely something that I must do.
Hmm.
And other
I'm
there are
waiting for it
other
to be fully translated. I'm
yeah,
just
yeah,
waiting for those volumes to come out.
yeah. I guess there's going to be a third volume coming out from Cambridge, so I'm looking forward to that. Uh, there are other commentaries from late antiquity that are useful. I've been writing on the Alcibiades one, and I've read the Proclus and Olympiodorus commentaries. Proclus, unfortunately, the commentary is a fragment. It only covers about a third of the dialogue. The Olympiodorus covers the whole thing. It's
Hmm.
very, very interesting to see the differences between how they approach these things and how I approach these things. But I do find myself, when I'm puzzled by a particular argument, I will reach for Olympiodorus, and oftentimes he can add something to it. So the ancient commentators are closer in terms of being part of a living tradition than later commentators. And that means that we should take them very seriously because there is a tradition of conversation and practice that surrounds these texts. And these texts consciously and unconsciously draw upon that. And there was a continuity of tradition in ancient philosophy. And that really has to be given some, I think, authority, treated very, very seriously. Otherwise, you are at risk of just losing too much. And a lot of 20th century and 21st century commentary on Plato, for instance, stuff from the analytic philosophical tradition, it's very interesting sometimes, but it's cursed, I think, by just trying to start completely afresh and not taking seriously uh, the ancients on this. And in fact, the whole concept, the coinage of Neoplatonism as a concept, in some ways was a polemical attempt to just cordon off the ancient commentary tradition and say that we can afford to ignore this. This was sort of a false path. This branched off into theurgy and scholasticism and stuff like that, and we can safely ignore that. And I think that's very irresponsible.
No, definitely. I totally agree. You get cultural insights as well that you would never know if you weren't connected to that ancient tradition. You know,
Yeah,
the history of commentary, even on like the Odyssey and the Iliad, and the way the Neoplatonists viewed Homer as being in continuity with this Platonic worldview, how these thoughts were connected to the Pythagoreans. I find Neo Pythagoreanism extremely interesting. You know, I've read some of the mathematical texts, Nicomachus of Geraza, and so much, you know, legitimate modern science is just directly descended from their work, and yet we never cover Pythagoreanism. I remember it being described in documentaries that I would watch as a kid as this like weird mystery cult kind of thing, but they wouldn't get into specifics, and I thought that's because we just didn't know very much about them. But we know plenty, so there's no excuse. It's so why do you think we're so ignorant about all of this classical literature now?
well, there are two reasons for that. One is that a lot of it's simply been lost. The crack up of the ancient world severed our connection with that world and destroyed a lot of the literature. And so we don't have enough context often to interpret this properly. And this is why the surviving ancient commentators are so important. They can say, oh, this is an idiomatic phrase in Greek in the fourth century BC, and if they hadn't mentioned that, well, none of us would know that.
Hmm.
Uh, One of the things that's very frustrating when you actually get down to the nitty gritty commentary of classicists on the Greek texts, and I'm not a classicist, uh, but I have occasionally come across puzzles that require me to look at the Greek text, and then you say, "Oh my gosh, there's a whole just tradition of debating about this passage uh, in Alcibiades one." And it's so interesting because some of these classicists and will or the philosophers that are drawing upon them, they'll simply say things like, "Well, this is grammatically not correct. We should amend this in some way." Well, but here's the problem with that. Uh, Plato, for instance, Plato's texts are a dense tapestry of literary allusions, including allusions to literature that we have lost. And sometimes when you include a literary allusion in a text, it's not perfectly grammatical. And yet you have these classicists who will look at something and say, well, that's not grammatical. That has to be changed or excised or whatever. And they can only say that because they're assuming that it's not a literary allusion to a text that's lost to us. And the vast majority of ancient literature is lost to us. So we have to approach this all with a great deal of humility. And when we find things that don't conform to our thinking, for instance, I've been reading a lot of the commentary on the Alcibiades one, and the reasons why various classicists and philosophers working in on Plato reject this text are often absurd. I've also been looking at the Alcibiades too. For instance, the Alcibiades too, people say, well, this can't be correct because it contains allusions to Stoic and Cynic doctrines. Well, it contains allusions to Stoic and Cynic doctrines that you have encountered already. That's true. And then they say, and because they've encountered these Stoic and Cynic doctrines first, they assume that, and then they read something like it in Alcibiades too. They say, well, this was obviously a later production incorporating Stoic and Cynic ideas. That doesn't follow at all, because it's is the case, and they know better for that Stoicism and Cynicism both, as schools of thought, also sprung from Socratic philosophy. And so, if you find ideas that sound like Stoicism or Cynicism in Socratic philosophy, you should, I think, say, well, here's another bit of evidence for Socratic influence on Stoicism or Cynicism. You can't arbitrarily decide that in some circumstances you're going to say, well, this is a spurious dialogue that was written after Stoics and Cynics. Yep, but they'll make these kinds of arbitrary interpretive moves. And I just think that that's just a bad way to do philosophy. Why do they feel licensed to make these arbitrary moves? Because they don't take the tradition seriously enough. The tradition, as it comes down to us, is there's canon of 35 Platonic dialogues plus the letters. These were arranged in tetrads, groups of four, by Thrasyllus, who was a Middle Platonist. He was an advisor to Tiberius. He was an astrologer. He was from Egypt, Greco-Roman Egypt, and he was a very learned man. He was taking up the canon that was handed down for 3 centuries from the death of Plato to himself, through the Platonic Academy and then the Library of Alexandria, and there was no question in his mind about what was genuine. They had access to commentary and debates about these things that have been totally lost. We also know that they were not uncritical because there is this list of 8 dialogues that were attributed to Plato at one time or another in antiquity, but were decided to be spurious. And he knew the difference between a spurious Platonic dialogue and a real Platonic dialogue. The idea had occurred to him and that whole tradition. And they had debates and criteria in place that allowed them to exclude the dubious and spurious dialogues and maintain the integrity of that canon. And we don't know the details of this because it's been lost, but we have to, I think, assume that they weren't just rank amateurs or idiots. And therefore, if we're handed a Platonic dialogue and we find it difficult to make sense of certain things based on our presuppositions, the last thing we should do is say it's spurious. The thing that we should do is treat the tradition as having some authority and revise our premises about what's genuinely Platonic. And I think that that's the best approach to take. So I accept the whole Thrasillan canon, and I think it's possible to do interpretive work that makes sense of all of these dialogues without resorting to things like radical emendations to the texts or excluding dialogues entirely from the canon.
Yeah, definitely. The way some modern scholars treat even Plato himself, but more so Proclus, is just so contemptuous and disrespectful at times. Like, I read this commentary on the Cratylus by Francisco Adamolo, modern commentary, and obviously, like, there is a surviving commentary by Proclus, or notes by one of his students that we have, and he hardly refers to it. And any metaphysical interpretation or concept, he just doesn't address or treats with scorn, and spends all this time on technical details of language, which is fine, but yeah, it's like, why are you interested in commenting on Plato if you don't really buy the metaphysics and you don't take the tradition seriously? It just seems
Yeah.
so bizarre.
So the first reason why they don't take these ancient commentators seriously is they don't take their tradition seriously. And the second reason, the second main reason, which you've touched on, is they embrace a completely incompatible philosophical worldview. And if you embrace that kind of worldview and you look at the Neoplatonic commentaries, they're just frustrating. And what is this alternative worldview? Well, you can call it modern philosophy in a very broad sense, but it was also the natural philosophy of early Greece and of Plato's time that he was reacting to. And so Lloyd Gerson, who's a scholar at the University of Toronto and a very, I think, a good scholar of Plato, Aristotle, and Neoplatonism, has a book called From Plato to Platonism. And in there, he tries to talk about the unity of a Platonic tradition. He published a book called Aristotle and Other Platonists because he sets Aristotle within the Platonic tradition, which is completely correct. His book is completely convincing to me. So is this book, From Plato to Platonism. And he says to understand what Platonism is as a phenomenon that stretched for close to a millennium before the last traces of ancient pagan philosophy sort of were submerged by Christianity and Islam, you have to understand it as a kind of research tradition, as a paradigm, as a school of thought. And the school of thought is unified by certain common concerns. Now, not necessarily common doctrines, because there are lots of disagreements within the broad Platonic tradition. But common concerns, that's what unifies it together. And that's what allows people to say Aristotle really is a Platonist, and the Middle Platonists are Platonists, and Plotinus is a Platonist, and so forth. So what are these points? He calls this tradition Ur-Platonism. And it's basically a rejection of things like materialism, mechanism, nominalism in epistemology, skepticism in epistemology, and relativism in epistemology and ethics. Now, materialism, mechanism, nominalism, skepticism, and relativism, all of these things existed at the time of Socrates and existed at the time of Plato. And they were rejected by the Platonic tradition, and they have returned in modernity and are the governing assumptions of the modern philosophical project for the most part. And that means that modern philosophers who are sort of steeped in this tradition and just assume on some level its metaphysical premises look back at Plato and they can't really see it. They can't really get it. And so they will focus on things like language. The Cratylus is an amazing dialogue, but it's not just about language. There's also this dimension to it that you could call theological. And the notes on the Proclus commentary that have come down to us are all about etymologies of the names of the gods. And these modern people, they just think, what rank superstition. The only thing that they can get out of it is just a discussion of language. And of course, what they assume about language in modernity is basically nominalism. And there's a great deal of hand waving and nitpicking and truly pin-headed analytic linguistic philosophy. And so that's the kind of stuff that they will focus in on if they read the Cratylus. So yeah, it's just the metaphysical assumptions of modernity at work here. But having those metaphysical assumptions basically makes it almost impossible to take Plato seriously, to take Plato at his word. The analytic philosophers are terrible about this. Another school that's really terrible about this are the Straussians. And the Straussians, they don't do the kind of nitpicking analysis of Plato like people trained in analytic philosophy will do. But their assumptions are largely modernist. They're largely Nietzschean. And they will bring those presuppositions to reading Plato. And so whenever they get to the metaphysical stuff, they just break out in hives. They're just allergic to it, and they want to hand wave it away. They want to treat it unseriously. And that's just no way to read Plato, because Plato is a metaphysician. He's not just engaged in moral and political philosophy. He's not just engaged in protreptic rhetoric and things like that. He's also a philosopher who's interested in big metaphysical questions. And to just treat that whole dimension as rhetorical or exoteric, I think just betrays a fundamental inability to take metaphysics seriously. And that is a function of uncritically accepting modernist metaphysical premises.
Right. Yeah. And we won't just talk about Plato. We will get into some other issues about, the modern world and implications. But, while I'm here with Greg's an expert on Platonism. I'm fascinated by the school. Please, indulge me as I ask some further questions about this. But yeah, it seems bizarre that it's even possible to neglect the metaphysical dimension when Plato really in befores a lot of these modern arguments. Like when you look at the position of Cratylus, like, okay, is this like proto-Saucer or Thrasymachus rather, like, okay, this just reads like Nietzsche. It seems like exactly like Nietzsche's philosophy, and or Protagoras, and I don't know, Derrida or something. But when you look at the sophists, it really comes across like the worldview of the modern academic. So how did this happen? Like, or like Proclus, in his commentary on the Parmenides, goes at length into the absurdity of the position that this is just some big dialectical exercise. Like Plato didn't have metaphysical intentions there. So it really baffles me. It almost raises the probability of some kind of conspiracy or bad actors. Do you think the tradition was kind of intentionally corrupted, or are there like nefarious actors at work here, or is this just bad scholarship?
Well, there is an agenda definitely at work in modern philosophy. And part of that is a definite political agenda. It has to do with creating a new order in Europe in early modern period. What was that agenda? Well, things like the Reformation took place and the wars of religion took place. And far-sighted thinkers realized that this was no way to run a society, and so they tried to create a new form of society. And one of the things that was done at that point was a conscious war against the ancients. So you see this in Machiavelli, who's one of the great thinkers of modernity and an enormously valuable political thinker on his own terms, somebody that I take a lot from. He took a lot from the ancients, but also he makes war against the ancients. Uh, Plato and Aristotle, the people who talked about ideal republics and things like that, in favor of realpolitik. You look at somebody like Hobbes. Hobbes is trying to create a secure, stable foundation for society in the same way that Machiavelli is. Machiavelli said that high ideals are a bad foundation for a stable regime. Why? Because the higher they are, the fewer the people who can actually attain them. And therefore, what happens is an unstable society. Whereas if you find a way of founding society on something that's low and common to us all, then that is a more stable foundation. That's the
Hmm.
pyramid, right? Rather than trying to balance a pyramid on its tip, which is a very unstable thing. So if you found the pyramid on a broad, low base, then you've got a more stable structure. What's the broad, low base? Well, it turns out to be things like the satisfaction of our material desires. That is a form of society that can appeal to everyone because everyone has material desires. People are afraid of dying, especially afraid of dying violent deaths. This is something that Hobbes talks a great deal about. And the moderns really want to create a society that's founded on the satisfaction of desire and the the fear of violent death, and namely avoiding violent death. And if you look at classical thought, and if you look at the history of pre-modern societies, who runs these societies? Well, people who are willing to risk death over points of honor or points of doctrine. There are things more important than life in pre-modern societies, and that's one of the causes of quarrel, historically speaking. And these early modern thinkers wanted to eliminate that, and so there was a conscious attempt to cordon off the classics and basically make them dead letters. You could take certain things from them. You couldn't just ignore them altogether. But the value system that's clearly present in Plato is completely different than the value system that's being put forward by somebody like Thomas Hobbes, for instance. And so, yeah, there's a concerted effort, I think, to dethrone classical philosophy with the early modern period. And this is connected with the attempts to dethrone Christianity as well. There's a tend towards secularism. First, it's tolerance, and then it just becomes open secularism and increasingly open forms of atheism. But yeah, that is part of the modern project, which is ultimately a political project. But those projects go way back into antiquity as well. So one of the most influential forces in modernity is nominalism, which is the rejection that there are actual, real, natural kinds. And nominalism existed in Plato's time and Socrates' time, and they were reacting against that. So there is that definite, I think, anti-classical agenda with early modern philosophy. Uh, but it's an agenda that the ancients saw as well. So, for instance, if you look at Aristophanes' clouds, which I deal with in my book, The Trial of Socrates, that's a that's a parody of early Greek modern natural philosophy, the modern philosophy of the ancient world, if you will. And one of the traits of these early Greek materialists and mechanists was there was a strong anti-religious dimension to this. So, and in some ways, with a later thinker like Epicurus, it's very clear that the primary driving motive for Epicurus was moral. Epicurus wanted to create a certain kind of peaceful life, a pacified society, peaceable men. And he looked around and saw one of the main causes of discontent was religion. And so, how does one banish religion and the discontent that it causes? Well, he took a metaphysics from Democritus and Leucippus and suggestions from other pre-Socratics, and he came up with an idea that the gods simply arise through natural processes, and therefore they're unreal. So Epicureanism in the classical world was very much a therapeutic atheism that created a metaphysics or adopted a metaphysics because it was serviceable to atheism and its practical implications. And you see that with modern philosophy as well.
Yeah, and if you take a sample of high IQ intellectuals and put them in a walled garden, like we do in our uh, academies and Epicurus did literally,
Mm-hmm.
things can seem to work out, but it doesn't actually kind of ground out in the real world. It doesn't provide a foundation where people really need it. People have a sense of the divine intrinsically, and you can try to work around that and cast doubt on the idea of the transcendent, which happens in the modern world, but it can't be completely stamped out, I think, and that's why Plato just won't, no matter how much he's tried, or people try to suppress Platonic concepts, which are perennial, it just always will come back, I think. So, what do you think about the role of Plato's philosophy in antiquity, kind of more broadly? You mentioned Lloyd Gerson. I didn't read his book, but I have read Ammonius and Simplicius's commentaries on Aristotle, and they had a similar view. So, in their view, Aristotle really was in continuity with the Platonic tradition, and Plato also. They liked harmonizing all these ancient thinkers. So Plato wasn't in disagreement with the philosophers really that came before him. They even kind of wrap Heraclitus and oh, what's his name? The
Parmenides.
Parmenides too, yeah, but the Four Elements guy starts with an E.
Empedocles.
Yes, Empedocles. There we go. It's early where I am. So yeah, they wrap all of this together into this kind of unified ancient philosophy, going all the way back to Homer, going to the mystery schools. So I mean, I think it's demonstrable that Plato took massive influence from the Pythagoreans. He had
Yeah.
Pythagoreans like Archytas in his school, so that's easy to show. And the stories about Pythagoras' life do connect him with this much broader kind of cosmopolitan, mystical worldview. So, what do you think about that idea of the kind of unity of the ancients that the later Neoplatonists talk about? Is there something to that?
Well, yes and no, because I do think there were doctrines that were held by ancient thinkers that were clearly rejected, and that the Platonic school defined itself by the things that it rejected. So it rejected mechanism and materialism as a way of explaining order ultimately.
Yeah, I will say that notably, Democritus is left out of this kind of
Yeah, yeah.
harmonization of the ancients.
Yeah, they also rejected skepticism, relativism, nominalism, which were ideas that were circulating at those times as well. Uh, for me, what's enduringly true about Platonism are a couple of things. So, first of all, whenever people talk about order, and you get these conversations with people who want to be Darwinists, the question is, do we even need to explain the existence of order? And an example of order would be life. Do we need to explain the existence of life in terms of things that are not alive? Obviously, Darwinists want to do that. They think that somehow order is in need of explanation. And I think that that assumption is questionable. Why is order in need of explanation? There are certain things that you just have to presuppose as sort of brute facts in the world. The materialist wants to say that the brute facts in the world are matter and space and motion. The Platonist would say the brute facts of the world consist of things like mathematical structure, life, and etc. Why is one of those set of brute facts preferable to another? Well, ultimately, the reason why people want to cleave to the materialist and mechanist explanation, I think, is twofold. One, there's a political and religious agenda, the agenda that was, you know, clearly laid out in Epicurus, but you can also see it parodied in the Clouds, which was a long time before Epicurus. Namely, the explanation of order, and one of these orders happens to be the gods, in terms of mechanistic causes, which is therefore deflationary. These things are ultimately unreal. And the other thing is that if things are simply material, well, we know how to push matter around. We can move matter around. And so it's a desire for power, a desire for control, a desire to remake things that leads people to want to pursue the hypothesis that ultimately everything is just, all order just emerges out of material elements in motion, and that's the primary metaphysical reality. And if we can insert ourselves in those processes, we can master everything. And I just think we have to question those assumptions from the very start. I don't think, for instance, that Darwinistic evolution can actually explain the existence of life. It can explain changes, right? Why do moths in polluted parts of the country start looking darker, right? They can explain changes in life forms, but I don't think it can really explain the emergence of organs and things like that. Xenophanes had this, evolutionary view that somehow there were eyeballs and arms rolling around and they would bump into each other and sometimes they'd stick, but that just assumes that there are eyeballs and arms. Where did these highly complicated forms come from? You simply have to, I think, treat form as metaphysically primitive. Well, if form or structure is metaphysically primitive, that's one of Plato's views. Another thing that I think is just a bedrock Platonic assumption is something that we can all observe in our communications with one another. And it is if you really understand it, it's completely incompatible with nominalism, relativism, and materialism. And that is simply the fact that you and I are having a conversation. And we're having a conversation about Plato. And even though my gums and lips and tongue are moving on one part of the planet, and this is being translated into, I don't know, electrical data, and it's coming out at the other end, and you're flapping your gums on the other end, and back and forth. And these are all entirely material things, and each material thing is unique and not the same as any other. Somehow we're talking about the same thing. There is this phenomenon of sameness within difference, sameness within manifold differences. And this sameness cannot be reduced to the material different elements that it shows up in. So if you're studying the Pythagorean theorem and it's written on the page in front of you and printed in ink, and it's being put on the board by your geometry teacher in chalk or dry erase marker or whatever, and you're thinking it in your brain, which is a material thing that's, all of those are separate material entities, and yet you're talking about the same thing. Just the sheer astonishingness of the fact that we talk about ideas, and ideas are not material things because material things are distinct. My quote unquote idea in my head is a different material thing than your idea in your head, and yet these ideas are about the same thing. What is this sameness that ideas possess? That I think is a key understanding, a key intuition that leads to Platonism. Another way of approaching this is when you go to the animal shelter and you want to look at the puppies. And there are all these little puppies running around of different shapes and sizes and colors. And yet they're all dogs. And the dogness of those puppies is the same in some sense. They're all dogs. And you get this in Plato's Parmenides, that the form manifests itself in experience as a one among many. There are many particulars, all of them unique, all of them materially separate and unique things, and yet they're all the same in some way, and they're all the same in some way that excludes the cats over there. That's just a remarkable phenomenon. So there's oneness that we experience when we think, and we do think. We're thinking creatures. There's oneness And there's also sameness. These ideal entities are not only ones amidst many, but they're also the same across every material instantiation that you can point to. Uh, Unraveling what that means metaphysically and epistemologically is Platonism.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never seen a nominalist or a materialist ever really deal with those phenomena. They just they don't have an alternative explanation. They'll say, well, things aren't really the same; they're just similar. Well, but what is similarity? Well, similarity can be analyzed as sameness and difference. And so the one in the plurality reemerges again. And so there's just I think a huge failure to really confront the experiential basis. And I'm not just talking about sense experience, but we can call it phenomenological basis. The phenomenological basis of Platonism in our experience of oneness and sameness in the material realm of difference. That is something that nominalists and materialists just never do justice to.
Right. And yet they do presuppose these universals and transcendentals in order to articulate their position. Like, oh, all things are just material systems. Well, material systems, that's a sameness in this multiplicity. You're presupposing a form to explain your materialist ontology. That should be obvious, right?
Yeah, yeah. Is my materialist ontology completely different from your materialist ontology? They would have to agree with that, but yet at the same time, that would just render the whole project of spreading materialism around to be kind of ludicrous, right?
Right.
No, your materialist ontology is wrong. Well, but it's mine. Uh, you know, relativism is very inconsistent with the very activity of philosophy.
I think
I
Cratylus got it
Yeah.
right ultimately in that if you reject that language is based on these real similarities, Socrates kind of propounds the, I guess, analogy theory of linguistic reference, you could say. And Cratylus ultimately, it said, gave up on the possibility of reference because of his kind of like tokenizing semantics. And that's ultimately where you would have to go. Like this, you just can't really say anything more past a certain point if you take these positions seriously. But of course, they have lectures to teach and books to write and money to make as academics, so they won't stop. They'll just be inconsistent. Okay, I would like to move on to some of these other points. I mean, this is all
Sure, yeah.
fascinating to me. So we've kind of glazed on Plato a bit here. What about any disagreements or criticism you have of I guess Platonism in general? Do you think that Plato had one kind of systematic philosophy? Did he leave open much ambiguity? Was he kind of reporting ideas that were around in his time, leaning one way without committing? So I guess two questions. How systematic do you think Plato himself really was? And where, if anywhere, do you think that system errs?
Well, I think he certainly had an ambition to be systematic, but the dialogue form is problematic. If he was a systematic philosopher, why did he not write treatises? Why did he write these dialogues? I think there are answers to that. And I do think that there is a system of Platonic ideas. He talks about how he's never expressed this in any kind of treatise in his seventh letter,
Mm-hmm.
but that the ideas are reflected in one way or another in the various dialogues. And I think that that's completely correct. So there is a system behind the dialogues. The system is never fully articulated by Plato in writing. It was being articulated by Plato in his school over a period of decades. and it was a research project. And there are tantalizing testimonia about the so-called unwritten doctrines of Plato. And Aristotle is one of the chief sources of this. And it's very difficult to put all this together because of the fragmentary nature of what's come down to us, these testimonia. But I do think that, yes, there was a systematic philosophy, and it was in some ways Neo-Pythagorean in its precedence, part of the Pythagorean tradition, specifically the Pythagorean emphasis on number in mathematics. There's this doctrine that's come down to us through Aristotle about the one and the indeterminate dyad. Now, if you look at this idea as Aristotle talks about it, and then look at the dialogues, you can see the dyad and the one referred to in various ways in various dialogues. You can see it in the Philebus, for instance. And what is that? Well, basically, this leads to a bunch of debates about the status of numbers in Plato's metaphysics. And we have, okay, we've got the testimonies about this. We have the Platonic dialogues, and we have reports from later antiquity that, for instance, Speusippus and Aristotle and Plato had debates amongst each other about the status of numbers in metaphysical status of numbers. And so obviously there's something open about this system if there are questions that were being debated in the school. It's certainly not a complete philosophy. But there was some kind of system that was being elaborated by Plato that was not fully manifest in his writings. The best attempts to reconstruct the unwritten doctrines are in the 20th century. And there's a book by J.N. Findley called Plato, the Written and Unwritten Doctrines, that also has a selection of the testimonia about the unwritten doctrines. It's very, very useful. And then in Germany, there's the so-called Tübingen School of Kramer and Geiser. And they've written about the unwritten doctrines. And so I think this is a very important area of Plato scholarship. It gets into deep speculative waters, and it can never really be, I think, solved because we just don't have enough data about it. We just have fragments and testimonia. So that's my thought about the systematicity of Plato's thought, and also
Would you
about.
agree? Sorry, before you go
Yeah,
on,
go ahead. Yeah.
would you agree that Plato himself, as far as how he reports his own view on what he's doing in his letters, was that he had a systematic? That's how he comes across to me in the letters. That Plato was
Yeah.
very confident that he had the whole picture.
Yeah, he had a system of ideas. I think that this was a system that was probably debated amongst him and his various students. And therefore, I think that maybe Plato's views on this weren't entirely settled either, and that there was a tradition within the school of debating about the status of number, for instance. And if you read the dialogues, there are lots of fascinating hints about where this could have gone. If you read the Timaeus and you look at the role of mathematics and geometry and the creation of material entities, for instance, it's all very suggestive. So for me, it's just a fascinating and I think ultimately insoluble puzzle, philosophical puzzle. And I just wish that we knew more about this. And sadly, a lot of the writings that could have thrown light upon this were lost in antiquity. We don't have most of, well, all of Aristotle's published writings have perished, except for bits and pieces that were incorporated into later writers. Uh, People like Speusippus, I don't think we have anything but fragments in Testimonia, and so it's just a sad, jigsaw puzzle, and half the pieces are missing. If I had a time machine, I would go to the Library of Alexandria with a great deal of with a photocopier or a scanner and a great deal of memory, and try and save all of these texts. So
Oh
then we
yeah,
would know.
no, definitely. Now, as far as what we can piece together, I think Proclus does a pretty great job as far as systematizing uh, Plato's philosophy. So, if we kind of go off of Proclus's assessment, do you think that there's any particular that the Platonic school misses, or is it pretty much the best option out there on all fronts?
Yeah, I okay. In terms of speculative metaphysical ideas, I okay. The idea of form. Form is a wonderfully rigorous and, I think, extremely austere and useful explanation of a lot of things. It's what we are thinking, and so it has an epistemological function. It explains the different the material contours and functions of different material things. So it has a metaphysical function to it. Uh, it also explains goodness. It has a moral function to it. The perfected form is the good, and it also has a an aesthetic explanatory value. It's extremely brilliant as a concept. So the beautiful, the good, the sort of metaphysical kinds, and how we, well, I don't, I guess we can just say intuit those kinds. All of that's explained by the same basic principle. I think that that's extremely powerful. If you want to then reflect on what form is, this is where you get into things like the one and the indeterminate dyad. So, for instance, uh, or the idea of the good, or you can also do the idea of the beautiful, because what do forms all have in common? Well, there's a oneness amidst pluralities. That's the one and the dyad. It explains the the beauty of particular things. It explains their moral perfection. It's all encompassed together uh, very, very nicely. So I do think that you you can get quite a lot out of it. The questions where things are sort of murky is how this relates to natural processes. Uh, the to Timaeus makes you think that there's like a creation story going on in time, and yet the later Neoplatonists, like Plotinus, would of course say, well, it's not really happening in time, and so that's on a mythological level. So, what is the relationship, though, of form to particular processes? How is it that information, if you want to use a sort of modern concept, how is it that information is enmeshed with matter and creates change? Because and we see that's true. I mean, we think of animals, plants. We think of genes. What are genes? Well, genes are materially encoded form, if you will, that have causal powers in nature. So how all this enmeshes with the material world, that's, I think, the most interesting question. And I think that's sort of still open. And that's what
Hmm.
they were debating. When they were debating about the status of number, uh, it was really, I think, about the the role of number as sort of an, and by number, really it just means uh, not just arithmetic, but or geometry, but even say, uh, would you call it mechanics? The speed of things, things like that. Anything that's measurable. This was understood as a realm of intermediation between the material and the ideal. And there's still, to me, a lot of question about how this actually works. How this meshes together with the material realm. Uh, that I think is a great field for further thought. And like I said, I'm not a Darwinist in the sense that a lot of people who are Darwinists are, because a lot of people are Darwinists because they're metaphysically committed to materialism and mechanism. Uh, they are committed to the idea that order needs to be explained, but that chaos doesn't.
Hmm.
And I just reject that bedrock assumption. So if there is order in nature and order replicates itself over time, if species change and evolve, and they certainly do, how is that happening? Uh, there is, okay, genes are, well, they're like ink and paper, right? They're, you can write ideas down in material media. Genes are ideas in material media.
Hmm.
uh, and they have a formative power in the real world. I think that's truly remarkable. And they were debating how this interface between the material and the ideal takes place. That's the best I can make of these debates that happened at the
Right.
time of Aristotle and the early academy about number.
So it sounds like essentially you would endorse the Platonic school as the best attempt at an explanation of how these
Oh yeah,
things
and
interact.
it should continue on. There's the Platonic school needs to continue.
Hmm.
Um, a writer, a philosopher that I think is sort of a Platonist about meaning is Husserl.
Hmm.
Uh, so you can't really seriously deal with philosophical problems without sort of sneaking back into Platonic answers sometimes.
Right.
As much as modern philosophy wants to banish this, if you take these ideas seriously and these problems seriously, you're going to come back to it. If you're just honest about how we experience meaning when we discuss things, anything, uh, this experience of oneness and sameness that's
Hmm.
irreducible to difference is real and can't be conjured away by
Right.
nominalists, much as they want to.
Well, if your worldview is based on intelligible features that have a harmony with the working of our mind, then everyone in principle has access to truth.
Yeah,
Whereas if you base your ontology on randomness and selection or something, and this flux ontology of time, then there's no accounting really for these big picture questions of value, and you have to default to authoritarianism. So I think it's just
yeah, and that's
easier.
really what nominalism is. It's a philosophy of authority.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, exactly, because it basically says that there is no order in the real world, and therefore we have to lay down the law.
Right. Yeah, this seems so
Basically, that's it.
bizarre. Again, I just don't know how someone gets to this worldview unless it's some kind of conspiracy. Because when you say that randomness and selection lead to the forms that we observe, well, you're defining a phase space of the possible interactions of this, random kind of spontaneous generation, and then refining down by these features of the world that lead to objective criteria for selection. Those are all kind of variables that you can only model in this abstract space. And when you do that, automatically you get probability distributions of all of these various possible outcomes. Gunter Beckley, a paleontologist, I don't think he's published on this yet, but he's working on this idea that you can explain the development of species and speciation better by assuming some kind of quantum computation in DNA that allows organisms or genetic lines to kind of read this probability space. Michael Levin, contemporary biologist out of Tufts, I think, is working on Platonic interpretations of morphogenesis. And again, like if you imagine that there's some kind of bottom up chemical process that leads to large scale structure, but in reliable, predictable ways, again, you are drawing a phase space with particular contours. There's a topology of that space that is fixed for all time as far as how we can describe it mathematically. So even these kind of flux-based evolutionist approaches, at some level, again, just like nominalists, presuppose an underlying order as far as they're making any meaningful claim. But yeah, I see all of the progress, especially with Michael Levin, who's doing just like insane, amazing stuff. He came up with the Xenobots and is developing like biological based AI systems and all sorts of really scary stuff as well. He kind of terrifies me, but he's a Platonist, and this conceptual
Interesting.
framework is actually conducive to solving problems because you don't have to work through all this dissonance where you're saying one thing and working on certain assumptions, but then claiming the opposite.
Right. Now, another thing that appeals to me about Plato is his psychology,
Mm-hmm.
the, the account of the soul. I think that that's enormously powerful, and it's really my worldview. I analyze things in terms of reason, spirit, and desire, or eros. I think that all makes perfect sense. It's a very powerful tool. I'm very impressed with his moral philosophy. I think it's just correct. I am very impressed with his thinking about politics. Of course, the question is, well, what does he really advocate in political philosophy? Well, I think in the end, he's an advocate of the mixed regime, as is Aristotle, as is Machiavelli, as were the American founders. And I think there are very powerful arguments that you can take more from the laws than the Republic in that direction. I think the Republic is a great work on psychology, moral philosophy. You can say even the philosophy of history and culture, but it's not really setting out a political regime in the way
Well,
that the laws does. So,
Proclus distinguishes that the Republic is about the ideal political system that is almost unattainable. So Plato kind of gives us different tiers of here's the utopian best of all possible states, and then here's the laws, something that's maybe more achievable that we can work with. That's what
yeah,
Proclus says.
yeah, the best regime and then the best possible regime, those kinds of distinctions. Yeah, I think that that's reasonable. I I do think there are things about the regime in the Republic that are, how to put it. I do like what Strauss and his school has done with the Republic, and with other dialogues, because they are very attentive to psychagogy, to the particular dynamic of Plato, or Socrates, I should say, educating his interlocutors. And therefore, there are features of the regime in the Republic that I think have to be understood in terms of his of Socrates' attempts to moderate the political ambitions of Glaucon. who's the primary interlocutor. And so you have to look at this in the context of an educational dynamic. And I have a piece called Introduction to Plato's Republic that's in my book, From Plato to Postmodernism. It's on the website, Countercurrents as well, where I talk about this. And I do think that this is the way of unraveling a lot of what's going on. There's a lot of drama in the Platonic dialogues. They are dramas. They look like little plays or little novels or short stories. And they need to be read that way.
Mhm. Well, they were
And
originally performed like by Plato's contemporaries. I think they were debuted like plays would be.
there would be readings, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't know if they would act them out, but there's not a lot of action anyway.
Right.
Uh, aside from Socrates putting his feet on the floor at a certain point in the Phaedo and leaving them there. Yeah, there's not a lot of stuff that's narrated that would be called action. But yeah, they're plays and they have characters and there's a situation, there's a time and a place, and so it is important to analyze all of these like you would any other drama. And I do think that if you look at, for instance, the Phaedrus, it's extremely clear that the Socratic dialogue as a form, as a literary form written that Plato and Xenophon and other writers practiced, is an exercise in psychagogy. It's an attempt to lead souls. It has a protreptic function as well. It's an attempt to draw people into philosophy. And the arguments are all modified by the interlocutors. And there's a discussion of this in the Phaedrus that, you know, philosophical rhetoric or any kind of rhetoric has to accommodate the audience. And so to get at what Plato's really saying, you've got to engage in some very complicated analysis. It's like it's some complicated bookkeeping. Let's put it that way, because uh, there are Plato's ideas, and then there are Plato's ideas as they would be accommodated to this particular character in this
Hmm.
particular situation with this particular educational agenda. And
Yeah,
so, yeah, it's
Proclus's
hard to,
sorry
yeah,
again for
yeah.
interrupting, but Proclus's commentary on the Alcibiades gets into that, interpreting, Socrates' function pedagogically in comparison with the daimonical order, and there's kind of a metaphysical connection there. So even this like protreptic function is totally integrated into the general metaphysics in a fascinating way. I definitely recommend anyone who wants to get into Platonism read Proclus or Olympiodorus on the first Alcibiades.
Yeah, and that is the first dialogue that they would teach in their curriculum on Plato. This was set up by Iamblichus. It was there was an earlier canon, I think by Albinus, that included it as an introductory text. But Iamblichus says that it contains all of the philosophy of Plato in seminal form, and I do think that that's true. Uh, it's very amusing. A. E. Taylor, who's a very good old school Anglo or Scottish, I don't know exactly, Plato scholar, has a great book on Plato. And in there, he says that the fact that this is such a perfect summation of Platonic philosophy counts against its genuineness, which I think is totally perverse. He
Mm.
also points out that there is something peculiar about it. And indeed, I think there is a point to doing linguistic studies of Plato, because we can see that his writing style evolved over time. There are certain stylistic changes that allow you to group later dialogues together.
Hmm.
And it's not just like the Socratic dialogues versus the more metaphysical topics. It's also just the way the writing is done. The vocabulary is different. The grammar is slightly different, and that's just true. We can see these patterns, and so we know what's late. And the Alcibiades one is early in its style. It's a Socratic dialogue where there's just lots of back and forth, yes and no, and yet linguistically, it seems to be more grouped with the later dialogues. But I think this is perfectly possible that late in his career, uh, Plato wrote a dialogue that reflects that later writing style that is a Socratic dialogue, like he wrote early in his career, and yet also implicitly contains the whole of his thinking at that time. I think that's a perfectly possible thing. And if you read the thing carefully, that's why the Neoplatonists thought this should be the first thing you read, because it is Socratic. It's sort of introductory. Some of it's kind of tedious. There's just a lot of minced up yes and no things, lots of tedious examples. Okay, what about butchers? What about bakers? What about candlestick makers? That kind of stuff. But it contains all the core ideas. They all show up, and it's a wonderful protreptic to beginning a philosophical study. Why wouldn't Plato himself have written something like that? The idea that it's so perfect that that counts against its authenticity just strikes me as the height of perversity from an extremely sensible scholar, usually.
Yeah, right. I had considered the possibility that perhaps this was a concession to his students, because what is unique about it is, yes, it does summarize a lot of the Platonic system, quote unquote, in one place, but it's also much more explicit about certain doctrines than you find in the other dialogues. So that would make sense if he was getting complaints from students. We don't know where to start. No one can follow this. Like, make this easier for us.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's a possibility. But what do you think about modern Platonic education? I would like to start a Platonic school one of these days. I'm working at it. We're also forming a community in Arkansas. So that's where it'll be based out of. But we have to build up the infrastructure before I can start actually hosting people. But I really just want to emulate the Iamblichian model of Platonic education. I think his curriculum is good. That's what my reading groups use. And I think so. Reading those ancient sources is one aspect of it that just can't be replaced, even aside from like an insight into this particular philosophical system, also just insight into the way of thinking of the ancients. Like, we've been just subjected to such unnatural conditions in modernity that we don't really understand kind of the organic mode of human communication and thought before all of this, before we've externalized so much. And, like, you know, in the dialogues, you even hear critiques of writing itself, whereas
Yeah.
obviously we're many steps down the line from that. And so we're just like derivative upon derivative from this original philosophical mode that they were really just living in. So I think you need to experience their writing just to understand, where did this come from? What was that original mind space that all of this science and technology did flow out from? But yeah, how do we, I guess, capture that in the modern day? The other aspect of it, of course, is that you would live with Iamblichus. You would share meals with him in the academy. They would wrestle together. I mean, it was a holistic way of life. So that's what I would like to emulate. Do you have other thoughts on how to do Platonic education in the modern day?
Well, I do think one scholar who's really tried to conjure up a sense of the context in which these ideas and texts emerged was Pierre Hadot,
Hmm.
who has written. He's died, I think, in 2009. He's an extraordinarily good scholar of ancient philosophy, including late antiquity. And a number of his books have been translated. There's his book on Plotinus called Plotinus or the Simplicity of Vision. There's a wonderful book on Marcus Aurelius. There's a book that just came out last year on Goethe that's really looks interesting. I can hardly wait to get to it. And just many essays on ancient philosophy, and he tries to, based on being a very good classicist, he pieces together all the contextual clues about how philosophy was organized in the ancient world, and tries to, like I say, conjure up that context a little bit. I think that the process of recreating that form of life is sort of like recreating old performance traditions in classical music, for instance. We have this whole field of historically informed performance, original instruments, uh, performances.
That's
And
funny because I would also like to start a Baroque orchestra. So,
yeah,
perfect
yeah.
analogy.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, what was going on? Well, okay, we have these instruments. We have examples of these instruments, physical ones. They're old instruments. We have descriptions of how things were organized, how people played, and so forth. But of course, these are words about practices, and so practice is always richer than words. And that's what's so frustrating about losing the tradition, because if we lose a tradition, all we have are decontextualized words, and these decontextualized words are articulations of practices that no longer are practiced. So what do you do? Well, it's like, looking at the original manuscripts of Vivaldi, right? And picking up a violin from Vivaldi's time and reading about performance practices. Okay, you can read about these things. You can look at the texts, and you can start playing the Baroque violin. And at first, it's going to sound very mechanical and weird and artificial, uh, but practice has its own integrity and richness to it. And at a certain point, by simply trying to reconstruct these old practical forms of performance, uh, you're going to get better and better at it. And you're going to be able to make beautiful music. And that's really a description of the evolution of historically informed performance in classical music. In the 1950s, it all sounded very strained, you know, and because they were just at the beginning, and it was being very consciously reconstituted from words. Yet practice is richer than words, and so as they keep working on it and trying to actually make this happen, and again make beautiful music, they sort of hit on ways of doing that. And so with its development over the last 70 years now, historically informed performance produces absolutely gorgeous music, and it is more authentic. And
Hmm.
so that's a good analogy, I think, for reconstructing the practices that would surround the philosophical texts that have come down to us from antiquity. It's going to seem a little larpy, as
Hmm.
people like to say at the beginning, right? But if you persist with LARPing, it will become real. It's like William Blake said, the fool, if he persists in his folly, will become wise. And that's the same with the LARPer. The LARPer who persists in his LARPing will become real.
Huh.
Uh, and as long as you achieve the telos of the activity and performance, it's making beautiful music, it's bringing these texts back to life. In philosophy, it's pursuing the truth and living accordingly. Then it might not be exactly the same as they did it in the past, but it's going to perform the same function. And the things that are missing, that were lost, will sort of naturally grow back
Mm-hmm.
around them because they have to.
Right. Well, because the form of life itself has some kind of attractive potency. It is active. It's not just something that is emergent from the bottom up. There's a real kind of attractor state in classical music performance or philosophical practice. They are very analogous situations. We have this huge literature on performance practice. Like I think anyone who wants to, even if they're not getting into Baroque performance practice specifically, but just who wants to be a classical musician, should read Johann Quantz's pedagogy on the flute, as well as like obviously using some of their technical exercises. I practice the Baroque flute, and uh, he covers so much more in that book on particulars of technique that the modern textbook that I got on the Baroque flute just couldn't even touch. So these texts are more detailed, they're more useful, and once you kind of approach the practice in the way that these earlier people did, then the details will be filled out. So, like, I started to understand the details of the sixth comma mean tone intonation system that most of these people were using. By once I kind of got in the mindset, these fine distinctions, I would not have had an ear for it before. I wouldn't have been able to recognize a comma difference or a major or minor semitone. So, and yeah, that's exactly the situation with the Platonic tradition. We have all of these texts, and just like classical musicians rarely read these, classical pedagogical texts, so people trying to do philosophy in the modern day just leave this huge corpus that is so detailed and so systematic and really
Yeah.
competitive as far as an explanatory worldview for our experience. We just leave it aside. But if you get into it and try to live consistently with it, then I think you're totally right. All those details will eventually come out. You'll get an ear for how to kind of approach the nitty gritty specifics. And I think the lifestyle is a big part of that as well. Plato in the Republic obviously talks about the education of the guardians and how important it is to temper the physical body with this blend of gymnastics and music. And if we neglect that part and just try to be academics and be dry about everything, then we're never going to get there because that's not how the ancients got there. So, yeah, I totally agree with that. Okay, so that kind of hit a couple of the questions that I wanted to ask you, and I know we're getting close to the end here. So, I guess for the average person, though, what approach do you think to morality in general is appropriate for our time? Not everyone is going to be able to attend a Neoplatonic monastery in Arkansas or even go through all these texts themselves. Most people would be utterly frustrated trying to read Proclus. And that's probably why Christianity took off as well as it did. They integrated these Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas to solve many basic problems in philosophy so that they would have answers to things. But then the core of their worldview was kind of fideistic, and you just could take it. Anyone could take it. You didn't have to be an intellectual. You could be a Christian, and then you got, as a bonus, all of this structuring, edifying philosophy that was kind of secondhand in the context of Christianity, but at least it was there. But then what do we do? Do we just advocate for Catholicism for the average person? Because the problem with Platonism it is an inherently elite activity. So how do we approach public morality if we really, privately hold true to Plato? Were the Straussians right, or what's the path here?
Well, I assume that when you get your little community together, that you're not all going to be philosophers, right?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
certainly.
Yeah. Okay. So, how do you popularize this? I mean, that's really the question: is Christianity just Platonism for the people? Uh, well, this is what I would do. This is my curriculum that I would have for anybody who's not mentally retarded by the time they're like 16, because people are coddled and intellectually stifled, and they could be much better educated than they are. But if I were creating a community and I was creating an educational curriculum, I would definitely lead everybody through Plato's Republic. And I think you can do that very carefully. And the stuff that's most vivid will stick, namely the analysis of the soul, the discussion of the virtues, the discussion of the cities, the progress of the different cities or decline of the cities. And I would also then lead them through Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And just those books together are pretty much a complete moral philosophy that people can use to guide their lives. And if people have questions, they come to their teachers, just like people with questions come to their priests or ministers to help deal with the stuff they can't figure out on their own. But Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics should be a basic curriculum for anybody. And these books can be made intelligible to anybody. They're quite, I think, they have their thorny passages and things like that. But the ideas in themselves are quite intelligible and compelling. And some parts are even quite compellingly written. And my worldview about moral philosophy is basically Plato's Republic and the Nicomachean Ethics. And yeah, you can get other good things here and there from the Stoics and from Adam Smith, from Kant. But honestly, Plato's Republic and the Nicomachean Ethics are pretty much enough for anybody to have a decent life where they're exposed to the right kind of virtues and the right kind of analysis of human psychology, and it's also inspirational, I think. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a start. And it's something that could be incorporated into kind of standardized homeschooling curriculum as far as practical application here. So I'll take that to heart, those two works. But then what about kind of the lived everyday metaphysico moral system that we have to have in order to be functional? I mean, Plato had that. He had a sincere piety, I think, in the pagan gods. Most people living today will never be able to achieve that, because even if you want to confess a faith, like, we don't have these temples, we can't practice in the way they practiced their religion, which was integrated into their philosophy. I mean, Proclus, right? I've always mispronounced it, but I guess Plato, is a mispronunciation as well. So I'm almost thinking like we
We can
pronounce
say these things in our
Socrates.
own ways.
Yeah,
It's like we don't say München, we say Munich.
right.
Uh, and we Anglos can be a little bit culturally appropriative and colonistic and whatever without apology about stuff like that. So we can say it our own ways.
Okay, well, thank you for the license there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of lost my train of thought, to be honest, but
Well,
uh,
we're talking about how this can be part of ordinary life. Uh,
right. Oh, yeah, and Proclus, I was going to say, incorporates the gods into his metaphysical system in line with the Neoplatonic tradition, I think in line with Plato himself, in an integral fashion, where you can't really have a philosophy of the forms without having a philosophy of the gods, and that's an inherently religious subject. So what about this question of, I guess, public religion? Nicomachean ethics and the Republic, definitely. But as far as what do people live with and revisit on a day-to-day basis, how do they connect with this kind of metaphysical ground of morality? Because I don't think philosophy alone will cut it for most people.
I think you need ritual. I think you need a common life. You need a common life and ritual. But how does this connect with ordinary experience too? Well, from a very early age, and Aristotle talks about this, moral education starts at a very early age. And before man is a rational animal or a political animal, he's a mimetic animal. We are imitative. And the way you teach morals is by praising and blaming. It's also the way you teach aesthetics. You teach people, you teach your children how to see, and there's ultimately an intuitionist element to this. There's no question. There's an intuitionist element. We see the right thing to do in particular contexts, and the mean, right, is a way of articulating how we hone in on the right thing to do at the right time in the right place. Ultimately, this is not casuistic. This is not legalistic. It's not deductive. It is intuitive. It's very practical. It's moral judgment and moral insight into the particular, into the right thing to do, is analogous to a judgment of taste. And this is one of the things I like about some of the later philosophers well, Hume and Adam Smith. They're both getting to something when they talk about the judgments of taste. The same is true with Kant. So just as you see the one in the many, you also see the good. You see the virtuous mean in the midst of the different vices of excess and defect, and it's a process of educating people's perceptiveness. Well, how do you do that? Well, using analogies from taste is extremely good, extremely, because it's basically the same thing. So you want to learn how to appreciate wine. Okay, how do you do it? Well, it's a process of guided comparative experience. The first comparisons are the grossest, and you can appreciate this without even opening the bottle. This is red wine. This is white wine. This is rosé, right? And the teacher points out the differences to you. And because we have a capacity to see difference and identity, it's like, yes, I see. I see the difference. Okay, you uncork the bottles and you start tasting things. Now, you can do this on your own, but it's always better to have somebody who's more experienced with you, because they can draw your attention to things that they have experienced and that you might not experience immediately. They can guide your experience and they can point to things, and they can use language that sounds silly and metaphorical, like this is oaky and this is fruity or whatever. Like they talk about tasting wine. This smells like blueberries and whatever. But what they're doing is they're guiding your experience to particular objective features in the reality that are there and you were otherwise overlooking. But once you see them, you can't unsee them. And then more and more distinctions show up to you. Well, that's the same process with moral perceptiveness. And it works through guided comparative experience. And so the way to live a Platonic Aristotelian moral philosophy is just to have the right parents and teachers and peers constantly drawing your attention to distinctions in the world. It's an exercise in moral connoisseurship.
Hmm.
And it can make your life astonishingly rich because there's just so much richness available in experience that people just sort of glide over because their eyes are not trained to see it. And so that's really the most concrete thing you can do. And you can do it from the very start. And you can do it long before you introduce any theory. The theories come later on to sort of set in stone and give an explanation for the distinctions that people have been trained to see.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great insight. It reminds me of Schopenhauer's philosophy on education. He says you can't let people read too many books, actually, because it leads them to be very detached from the real world. Education should be about exercising the understanding in nature, seeing real physical processes. I don't know if he directly applies it to morality and moral education, but it would be consistent with his view. And I see that taking place in our circles over the last 8 years. I think 8 years ago, the average person in dissident right spaces was more of a degenerate, and they were less sensitive to these moral distinctions. And as the rhetoric has kind of proliferated and been digestible, stemming from intellectuals who have been working at it, like yourself, for years, but as it became popularized after 2015, 2016, I see a real difference. People are kind of attuned to these moral distinctions, and they've become more real because we
Hmm.
are leading each other to think about them.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a great believer in some ways, the primacy of practical reason. Uh, what does that mean? Well, it means things like this: we know more than we can say. Therefore, life is richer than theory. And that this is why one has to reconstitute the whole lived context of ancient philosophy to really know what it means. And that's a difficult thing because the theories are articulating life, and life is always richer than theory. And therefore, uh, theories come later. Before you have theories, you live, but living can be done in a very intelligent way, in a very discerning way, in a very sensitive way. And that's something that can be taught. And it's enormously important to just discard this stupid idea that modern educators like to put forward, which is that people should just experiment and discover things for themselves. That's crazy. Uh, that's basically just civilization, tradition, all of that just goes out the window. We should just experiment for ourselves. No, what we should do is we should have experiences, but these experiences need to be guided by intelligent people who can draw our minds, our attention to things in experience that we might otherwise overlook. And once we see them, they can't be unseen, and that becomes a foundation. And so experience is the primary thing, but it's not dumb brute experience of the individual, the abandoned child, the feral child. It is the experience of the person who's an heir to a tradition and is an heir to a tradition before he even needs to read a book, because the richness of a particular way of life, the distinctions that it allows you to experience, the beauties and the horrors that it sensitizes you to, can be given to you very, very early on if you have the right kind of parents and community.
Yeah, to train a moral elite, though, you kind of need a moral elite, which the bootstrapping issue is a little bit problematic. But I think enough of us can reconstruct this way from ancient sources, from reading, and from just kind of our own philosophizing, and then we can convert that if we organize appropriately. So, what about that then? The kind of aspect of participation in a broader community as it relates to identity. We're both in identitarian spheres, and Platonism, it seems to me, offers natural justifications for the significance of identity. I mean, explicitly in Pythagoreanism, the same is privileged over the different, right? These are in the column of the odd and even, respectively, from the Pythagorean table of opposites. And so it's just in line with that general worldview that there is a natural sympathy between things that are similar. But are there some like deeper, I guess, metaphysical arguments? How can we use this philosophical framework to bring like-minded, similar people together to form this kind of organic society that Plato talks about, and then b, how do we convince many people that this is actually like a priori clearly morally preferable, because people always appeal to individual preference and this kind of libertarian free will, and free association. And luckily, in practice, free association leads to identitarian enclaves, whether it's in a lunchroom or anywhere pretty much where there's not state coercion forcing integration. But yeah, those two questions. How do we use this Platonic framework to justify identitarian approaches to politics? And then how do we kind of use this as an operating system in building communities? I'm interested in that question, of course, because I'm trying to build a community. So any insight there would be greatly appreciated.
Well, Platonism can be subversive of community and identity in a certain way. Because the same, well, the same in difference. Why not just talk about one race, the human race, right? If you approach this in a purely theoretical way, there's an inherent cosmopolitanism to philosophy, and the best way of living the cosmopolitan life is academia, I suppose. But academia is not a model for a community. It's not a model for real life. And so you can't just leave this at the level of theoretical reason. But Plato teaches us that the human soul is more complicated than just theoretical reason. There's thumos and epithumia. There's desire. Now, desire is cosmopolitan too. Everybody's desires are basically the same. And wouldn't it be better for us to satisfy our desires if we had a global marketplace, right? The part of the soul that is anti-universalist, that's communitarian, that's identitarian in the sense of particular identities and attachment to particular peoples and places, is thumos. Thumos is inherently partial. And thumos is the political emotion. It's the political part of the soul. And I think that if you take somebody like Carl Schmitt's concept of the political, what gives rise to the political? It's the distinction between us and them. That's a thumotic distinction. It's tribalism. And so I think the way to justify identitarianism is to rehabilitate thumos. And thumos is the part of the soul that early modern philosophers just try to write out. The modern picture of man is basically desire. And what is desire? It's an infinite continuum. You can desire one thing after another to infinity. And Hobbes actually talks about this. The life of desire is this restless pursuit of one thing after another thing that ceases only in death, right? It's an infinity.
An inextinguishable flame. Yeah.
Yeah. And this infinity, to be moral, has to have measure imposed on it. From a Platonic or Aristotelian point of view, and so, but for the Hobbesian, we've got this infinity of desire, and then the question is, well, how best to satisfy this infinity of desire? Why? By using our technical and instrumental reasoning faculty. Reason is technical and instrumental in modernity, and it's subservient to the satisfaction of desire. That's a particular economy of the soul that you find in modernity. Now, what about Thumos? Well, Thumos for Hobbes is a very peculiar thing. He pours enormous scorn upon it. He talks about pride and vainglory. These are sources of trouble, right? This has to be bottled up. But in some ways, he still presupposes these sort of honorable passions that are connected with Thumos to get his whole system off the ground. But modernity is anti-thumatic. It tries to turn us all into peaceful vegetarian bonobos, right? And to get rid of borders and nationalism and patriotism and all these functions that are these passions connected with the thumatic part of the soul. You look at somebody like John Locke. What is John Locke's political philosophy about? It's about securing the life of the industrious and the rational, the hardworking, rational person who's trying to satisfy his basic needs and maybe a few more from the danger presented by the contentious and quarrelsome. That refers to basically men of honor and ideologues, specifically Christian ideologues. They were a huge problem at the time. And that's how we got to this modern world where we don't even have a vocabulary anymore for talking about honor in a non-pathological way. That has been that's part of the modernist project of rewiring the human soul, and it's a profoundly destructive project. And of course, what it leads to is a cosmopolitan civilization where you've got desires that are shared by all of humanity and reason, theoretical, practical, technical, instrumental reason, which is implicitly shareable by all of humanity, at least the smart ones, right? And these are in alliance together against the remnants of any kind of particular identity that might cause a blockage to the free flow of goods and ideas. And so, to get identitarianism back and to get people capable of even understanding themselves as more than producer consumers, we have to rehabilitate Thumos.
Wow, yeah, that's a great insight also. And in very much in line with the Platonic theory of the function of thumos, which is to join the rational and appetitive faculties. So, yeah, it makes sense if you have a deficiency of thumos. Well, reason is more of the eternal, and appetite is more of the world of generation. And the motive principles in appetite will therefore change more. They'll be more uh, dynamic, and they'll be kind of fighting for their role, whereas and their telos, and they're multifarious. So there's many of them competing, and reason, which is inherently kind of pacific and inward facing, it likes to revert on itself, will just be pushed around. It's like the nerd being pushed around by the ugly school bully, basically, and you need that, like the virtuous, heroic quarterback, Thumos, to come in and restore proper order. So it's sort of like a high-low versus middle.
Yeah.
Like that's a political theory that like social elites like to ally themselves with the lowest elements of society to work against the potential competitors arising from the middle. But then naturally that leads to a disunified society. And it's totally true that appetite is this kind of universalizing function. Reason is a universalizing function in a way that I think is legitimate. I do think there should be that cosmopolitan class. I do think we have global existential threats that we have to address, and like we do have to
Yeah.
put heads together around the world. So that has to happen. But if you don't have Thumos kind of joining these antithetical ones, you have the one of intellect and the one of matter, right? Matter's generic, intellect at its pinnacle is unitive. So you have a one on both sides, but then in between that, you have the intellect being joined to particular matter, and that's this principle of differentiation, individuation, which is indispensable for that greater whole to come about. So yeah, you can descend away from form into pure matter by being led by appetite, or you can kind of transcend the particular distinctions in the world by focusing on the universal, and maybe a certain class of person that is what they should do with their life. That's what they should be dedicated to. But it's a very rare person, and like trying to democratize that cosmopolitan type and make it commonplace is just completely impossible. You know,
Yeah,
the
and
bell
this
curve
is
is real. So
yeah, and this is one of the bad things about modernity. I mean, modernity tries to universalize the college campus, universalize the academy, make it a model for society. It's implicitly cosmopolitan, and it's a it's a projection of the ethos of an elite, an inherently cosmopolitan elite, onto all of politics, and it
mm-hmm.
just doesn't work.
Right. And I know you're pretty much out of time now. I just thought it was interesting also that so Thumos is also translated as spirit sometimes. And if
Yeah,
Thumos is the kind of critical thing in producing this real differentiation in the world into distinct kinds and preserving those kinds, then like is Hegel onto something with this idea of Geist, you know, and
yeah.
Rousseau
Well,
comes to mind. I wonder, you know, thoughts
yeah.
on that.
Well, I think it's perfectly reasonable to understand at least part of what Hegel's talking about in the phenomenology of spirit in terms of, well, the struggle for death, to the death over prestige, the so-called master-slave dialectic, or the beginning of the master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit, can be understood as thumotic.
Mm,
The process of the struggle to the death over honor leaves us with two kinds of men. It's a differentiating struggle. It gives you the choice of putting death above dishonor, preferring death to dishonor, or preferring uh, dishonor to death. The man who puts death before dishonor will not surrender, will not give up. And the man who is willing to give up, to surrender in order to preserve his life at the expense of his honor, is a second type of man. The first type of man is the free man, the naturally free man. The second type is the naturally slavish individual. Now, this idea of being ruled by your desires, and that includes your desire for self preservation, or being ruled by your honor to the point that you're willing to actually give up all of your desires, including the self preservation, by giving up your life. That's two fundamentally different kind of men. And you can understand that in terms of the psychology of the Republic. Because in the Republic, you have this idea, okay, there are different parts of the soul, and there are different regimes, right? There's the soul is organized politically. So you can have a dominant part of the soul. You can have a soul that's ruled by reason. It rules over thumos and desire. You can have a soul ruled by desire. Desire trumps reason and thumos. Or you can have a soul that's ruled by thumos. So when there's a conflict, thumos will trump reason and desire. And of course, you can have sort of a more complicated thing. You can say, well, I'm the kind of guy whose thumos is stronger than his desire, but I also recognize that discretion is the better part of valor, and therefore I am going to allow my reason to rule my thumos. Because even though I might be willing to throw my life away over a point of honor, you can only do that once, and you better damn well count. And so, at that point, you're really saying, reason is going to be the ultimate factor here for me, because the passions have to be discerning, and this is how I understand uh, moral education. Moral education sort of breeds discernment into the passions themselves. It breeds discern. It sort of maybe beats discernment into it. It infuses it with discernment. So if you have literally educated your tastes, and by that I mean even your taste buds, right? I mean your senses are aware of distinctions, and these distinctions can be made manifest through a certain kind of education. And so you can you have a taste for certain things and a smell for certain things, and moral insight for certain things. You get a taste for who's lying. There's a and this is real. After a certain point in my life, I just had a smell, a sense of smell, in quote unquote, for bullshit, right? You can just hear it, taste it, smell it. You don't even have to be able to articulate what's going on. You just see it, and that's what it is to be educated. And so when you educate the passions, for instance, when you uh, teach the virtue of courage, what's teaching the virtue of courage? Well, it's informing thumos with discretion, so that you can act better. What's the virtue of moderation? It's informing desire. It's informing epithumia with discretion. So I think that that's, this is why I like certain modern writers who write on things like taste, because I think it's actually quite consonant with what ultimate what for somebody like Aristotle, moral insight ultimately looks like.
Mm. Yeah, again, great points. The other dimension I just like to highlight before we wrap up, I know you do have to go, is that it's kind of lucky that this thumatic element correlates to the pneuma, which is intrinsically communal, right? So pneuma or spirit joins the reason to the body. We have kind of the rational soul, and then the pneumatic vehicle, and then the body. So I think Thumos is wrapped up in the pneuma in some sense. And the pneuma is not just our individual pneumatic body, which we do have to exercise and educate, uh, and cultivate that fortitude. But beyond that, there is the kind of universal pneuma that we're all participating in. And then there's that particular spirit that runs through a people. And I think it has like a gravitational effect, so that if you're around other people who are strengthening their thumatic element, then that will be strengthened in you. So I'm getting from Platonist Greg Johnson that we need to emphasize practice, cultivation of courage, strengthening of thumos. And I totally agree. And I think that the communal element is the critical piece to facilitate that and train that generation of moral elites that we need to then begin like restructuring our now decaying and like pathetic Western society. So I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you can come on again sometime in the
Oh
not too
yeah, I'd
distant
love to.
future.
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to do that. It's been a really enjoyable conversation. I love talking about philosophy. It's the Well, as we know from reading Plato, it's the most important subject you can study. It's the most important subject because wisdom is unconditionally good. And every other good thing is good only on the condition that it's wisely used.
Hmm.
So you might think that studying, uh, I don't know, finance and auto mechanics and going to chef school and stuff like that are good, and they are good, but they're not unconditionally good, right? You might take pride in how beautiful you are, but you can be too good looking for your own good. You might be very pleased by inheriting a lot of money, but you can be too rich for your own good. All the things that fortune can give you that you think are goods can actually be bad for you if you're fool enough to misuse them. And so nothing is unconditionally good except wisdom itself. That's the great Platonic protreptic to studying philosophy. So there's literally nothing more important than what we're talking about today.
Yes, wise words from the great Greg Johnson. So, again, pleasure speaking with you. Everyone, check out Countercurrents and all of Greg's publications. Everyone, have a good rest of your day, and God bless.